Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hello from wherever you are. This is the GY CAF 2022 webinar sessions, which you're looking to basically enhance the capacity of young people across the globe on issues of climate finance. And this particular session is focused on supporting young people to transition from COP26 basically into SB54. How can young people continue to meaningfully engage on issues of climate finance issues? Our topic for today, for this particular session, is youth engagement within the loss and damage finance and implementation, because we know that one of the key challenges within the negotiations has been basically finding finance for loss and damage and basically how to quantify issues around finance. So today we have a team of experts that will probably support us to unpack and understand better the issues of loss and damage, basically. So, the IPCC report indicates that we have less than 10 years, approximately 8 years, before the impacts of climate change become irreversible. On 5th June 2021, the UN launched the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. This basically means that this is the decade of climate action according to the UN standards. So the timeline is quite critical, especially for young people, given that after 8 years, they shall be seeking to transition, of course, from young people into basically adults. And how are they going to engage? And we need to realize that the decisions made today, we are going to basically live the consequences of the decisions that are made today at these global, continental, and national issues. As we seek to implement this decade of ecosystem restoration, as well as the Paris Agreement, I'd like our speakers to basically introduce themselves, where they come from, and basically tell us basically how their work relates to issues of loss and damage and climate change and climate finance negotiations. So first of all, I'd like to start with Malcolm to basically inform our audience what he does and how it relates to issues of loss and damage. So Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Malcolm Radat. I work in the UK's COP26 Presidency Unit, and I am the leader on both the adaptation and loss and damage negotiations. I also, at the moment, am chair of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, and I've worked on this area for a number of years now, as I have worked in the Development Ministry of the UK government for a while. So I am intimately connected to what happened with loss and damage at COP26 and what led up to it.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's good that you're here and you're from the UK government, who are the host, of course, of the previous COP26. And it's important that as the co-chair or the chair of the WIM, it's very important. So our audience will get to interact with you more. So next, I'd like to give the floor to Ivana to introduce herself, what she does, and how it relates to loss and damage. Ivana?
Thank you so much. So my name is Ivana, and I am a graduate student of environmental policy at Sciences Po Paris, and I just completed my internship at the UNFCCC in the loss and damage unit. So I am also quite although in much shorter time span than Malcolm, I also am quite intimately linked to the issue, and I was lucky enough to be able to follow the COP26 negotiations. And as part of my internship with the loss and damage unit, I was also able to do some work on the Santiago Network. So I look forward to exchanging with everyone here today, and thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be here, and look forward to our fruitful negotiations, or discussions rather.
Thank you, Ivana. Very interesting. The Santiago Network is really critical on loss and damage issues. I'd like to go to Pierre to introduce himself, what he does, and how it relates to loss and damage.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all, and I hope you are hearing me quite clearly. With a number of other people, I'm coordinating what is called the Loss and Damage Collaboration, which is a group of stakeholders with different backgrounds and from diverse horizons, I would say. We have academics, youth, we have also advisors to negotiation groups, and doing and also so we have a collaboration of around 100 members. And although I'm not versed, I think as versed as some members here in this webinar in some technical details, I hope to be able to shed a light on some of the process, at least contribute to shedding a light to some of the loss processes on loss and damage. So yeah, here I am.
Thank you, Pierre. Very interesting. Looking forward to getting your insights, especially from the collaboration, whether or not young people we can engage and how we can basically engage. I'd like to give the floor to Bertha to basically introduce herself and tell us what she does and how it relates to loss and damage discussions.
Thank you very much. So my name is Bertha Argueta, and I am a policy advisor for climate finance and development, and I'm a civil society organization in Germany called German Watch. I have been working on issues of basically climate finance more broadly, not specifically loss and damage finance, but it is part of the work, and it's increasingly a focus for everyone, including in my work. So I work on climate finance issues broadly and specifically as well in what relates to the Green Climate Fund with civil society organizations in Africa. So that's another aspect of my work as well. So very looking forward to this fruitful conversation with everyone.
Before we hand over basically from you, Bertha, I'd like to stick to you, and I'm glad maybe you can tackle our first question, then go back to Ivana, because Ivana, of course, has mentioned that she's from recently working with the UNFCCC. So COP26 was dubbed the Climate Finance COP, and you're a climate finance expert basically within this discussion. It pushed the international community forward towards implementing the Paris Agreement, though it was not a big leap as you expected, but it was still a leap. In your perspective, do you think COP26 advanced loss and damage issues, finance, discussions, implementation? If so, how far and what are the lessons and best practices that we can learn from COP26 in terms of loss and damage and moving forward? So I'd like Bertha to sort of open with that, of course, your perspectives. Then we move immediately back to Ivana. So Bertha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I don't know about best practices when it comes to COP, but I will say that it can be seen in a sense as the first big push towards putting loss and damage finance on the agenda. It's not that this is completely new, of course, but this is could we argue in the context of the negotiations, the first time that this has been like really put forward in the agenda from the focus of finance, at least. I would say, you know, obviously, from the perspective of not all civil society, I don't claim to speak for all civil society, but you can say that overall the balance is on, like, of course, there are some things that moved forward. There is a dialogue that has been established to look more deeply into what loss and damage finance could be and might be in the future. Unfortunately, the asks of developing countries were to go a bit further than that, you know, and just to try to get a compromise on the creation of a facility that could actually finance this loss and damage in the future. We didn't see that happen, and some people argue that it was not ripe to say like that because there's still many questions about what this facility should look like. But there was this first big push, you know, and what we got is a dialogue. Now, what that dialogue might actually look like, we still don't know, you know. Ideally, it would be something that would actually move towards creating some sort of mechanism, some sort of understanding of what climate finance should be in the future. But it is also likely that would yield just more talk and more meetings and more discussions that never end. You know, because loss and damage finance, I would say, is a very, very delicate topic. It's something that, you know, it has many, many other implications. And therefore, it's something that is very likely in the future to be very controversial in these discussions. And so at least we have a dialogue. So we have a space where this is going to get discussed and where technical, but also obviously political issues are going to be discussed in the coming years. So, I mean, to not completely, I'd say the balance is mixed, but at least we are moving forward in the conversation about what loss and damage and specifically loss and damage finance is going to look like, you know. And of course, the lessons, I would say, I mean, I don't draw any particular lessons from COP itself, but I think it is important that these kind of dialogues are very open, they participatory, and they include all stakeholders. And I speak, obviously as a civil society organization, that it includes civil society, that they're not only ideally, these political decisions that get made at the high level, but that they actually include a process where there's more participation from those involved, and especially the communities that are going to be impacted by losses and damages in the future. So yeah, I mean, it's not that, as I said, this is not a lesson that I would say we learned from COP, but it's usually what we advocate for, participation and, processes and outcomes that really reflect the needs of those that are going to be more affected by climate change and the losses and damages related to it. So I will stop there, and yeah, hopefully I've answered your question.
Yes, you have actually. So thank you for that. Very interesting discussions, a dialogue. So you should be more open. Ivana, I'll leave you to have a jump at that. Then we'll jump over to Malcolm. And then
Thanks so much. So first of all, I just want to say that although I have said that I did my internship with the UNFCCC, obviously everything that I say here in no way or shape or form reflects official position of the UNFCCC. I'm intervening in a personal capacity. So from a personal point of view, I would say that I would agree with Bertha on what she said about, yes, there has been a dialogue established and at the COP26. I think that there was a decent progress made, but at the same time, we do have to keep in mind that, the objectives might are being set in quite a slow pace, and unfortunately the science and the physical impacts of climate change are, it appears, moving at a pace a little bit faster than the negotiations. At least that is my perspective. And we also can't overlook the disappointment that was expressed by developing countries over the results of the COP, particularly when in regards to this financing facility and the results on climate finance. Sorry, not on climate finance, but on finance for loss and damage. So whether there is definitely a lot of work to be done. And let's hope that this dialogue that has been established will lead to fruitful results. I know that everybody who is working on this issue is working really hard, and that they are trying to reach some sort of compromise as soon as possible, so things can move forward. And I would also like to highlight that from what I could see, there was an amazing engagement from youth organizations and civil society at the COP26. So it is clear regarding loss and damage. So it is clear that it's really becoming a central issue of the negotiations going forward. And so this also gives us hope in regards to future negotiations and future COPs.
thank you for that. Very insightful. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think that I'd preface this, but by saying that the job of a COP president, many people say, is to make everybody equally unhappy. And it's important that as the COP president, you're trying to find where there will be consensus, but of course, looking to push climate ambition as strongly as possible. And certainly that's what we were aimed to do. I think in the past, the issues of loss and damage have been very difficult at the COP, with some parties not really wanting to discuss it at all in any kind of substantive way. And I think that COP26 changed that in a very significant way. I think that the fact that the decisions, one, loss and damage pitched up in the main cover decision, politically, that's very significant with its own section. I think also that parties accepted that loss and damage was real and it was growing, and that more needed to be done. In the past as well, there had been a lot of language, and this is where the negotiator in me comes out, where words matter in negotiations, where previously it had always been avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, which arguably covers everything from mitigation to humanitarian response and everything in between, because you avert loss and damage. Well, the best way to avert loss and damage is stop the climate changing in the first place. But in the decision, we had a paragraph that urged developed countries to add more finance to address loss and damage, with the omission of the words avert and minimize. So I think in terms of thinking about action on loss and damage, there was a significant step forward, which was one of the significant steps was just the omission of the leaving out of two words. So there's the space, if you like, for loss and damage action. I think also then where you had some parties who then quite late on in the discussions, the G77 came forward with an idea for a loss and damage finance facility, which caught a lot of the other countries a little bit by surprise, and was quite controversial. At the same time, you had a report from the OECD, and indeed the talk of a set of other donors, talking about what funds are already made available for loss and damage, be that work on what looks like today is classed as adaptation, whether that's work on response to loss and damage, which is often classed as disaster preparedness or humanitarian response. So basically, there's lots of bits of money around, and a lot of the response to the call for a finance facility for loss and damage, the response from a lot of parties was, what do you mean by that? There's already a lot of funds for loss and damage. But importantly, it was recognized by COP26 that more needed to be done. So we're left at the end of COP26 with the question of what is this more that needs to be done, and that that finance is certainly part of that equation. It's not the entire part of the equation, because also we had coming out of COP26 the Santiago Network, which is about providing technical help. Now, going into COP26, I'll be frank with you, I thought we were not going to get very much on the Santiago Network. Actually, what we got, I think, exceeded the expectations of most parties, in that we got a Santiago Network which will have a secretariat which will be able to practically help people, practically help countries, and money pledged to actually fund the technical assistance that's needed, not just find the right person, but actually pay for the work. At the end of that, if the Santiago Network works well, we should have sets of project proposals, ideas for funding coming out of countries saying, we told you loss and damage is a problem. Here is what is needed for funding. And we have a Glasgow dialogue which talks about the funding arrangements for that. I think that sets up a powerful process and incentive for practical action on loss and damage in a way that goes around one of the substantive problems in the negotiations, in that when there is a demand for finance with a loss and damage label, you get an allergic reaction from donors. However, if there is the answer, actually, we understand that loss and damage is a problem, how then can we increase action so as to make a difference? Then there is a conversation that people are willing to have. And I think that COP26 showed that that conversation is possible. So for the coming year, it's about making that possibility real, both through developing the Santiago Network and the Glasgow Dialogues, which will, if it's bad, and I'm with you, Bertha, it can be just a talking shop, right? And that it is imperative that it is not just a talking shop. First challenge, right? In that, we should also remember that the Working Group 2 report of the IPCC is about to come out. And it is not going to be comfortable reading. The Working Group 2 report will once again show that the impacts of climate are worse than people thought and are moving faster than people thought. That report, I think, will help to concentrate people's minds to make sure that they will actually make a reality of taking action on loss and damage and climate impacts. And I hope that COP26 has started the process to actually make that practical and real. I think there are still dangers along the way, because I think there is still not agreement on finance for loss and damage, where you get a disagreement by some saying, well, what does that mean? There's already finance in humanitarian and stuff like that, humanitarian and adaptation and things like that. But given now we have an undertaking for donors to look at finance to address loss and damage, not to avert, minimize, and address, so specifically on loss and damage, and mechanisms to assess what the needs are and responses to it, I think there's the possibility of a very positive and action-based conversation going forward. And that's where I think civil society has a very strong role as the practical side of this equation. Because I think there's all kinds of political discussions that can be had about we want a fund for loss and damage, which is more of a political point than a practical point. And to say, actually, people and the world can't wait. There needs to be action right now. And then what then is the world going to do in the run up to COP27 to make good on the promises of COP26? And that's the challenge that faces us this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Pierre, maybe your take on this particular agenda.
Yes, sure. Just a proper disclaimer, as Ivana did as well. So there are a lot of developing countries in the loss and damage collaboration, and my position will not represent what they think. I also want to say that I currently work at the United Nations, but this is a different role. So my position also does not represent what the United Nations take on this. I really speak about on behalf of the collaboration more as a global group of stakeholders engaged in loss and damage. I'm going to be brief because I think you have also all the questions, and you wanted the webinar to be not too heavy for our listeners. But I would go actually quite in the line of what Malcolm said. Compared to the usual pace of negotiations, the progress that was made on loss and damage was actually significant at COP26. Of course, it doesn't meet the expectations of the developing countries, but again, the claim for loss and damage facility was made in the second week, when already there was great progress made on the language around loss and damage finance in the final cover decision. So it came a bit late in terms of negotiation temporalities, although of course we saw that it could still get to something. Maybe ahead, go on the road to COP27. These positions can be built ahead, and we saw really the interest of developing countries converging on the language in the last days. So with P77 supporting the AOZ's proposal only after a few days after AOZ's proposed it. So going forward, let's try to build momentum a bit more and bring conversations so that they don't come at the last minute at COP, although it's also parts of the process. Going back to my first point, so we had actually quite progress on loss and damage finance, although it didn't meet the expectations. Speaking with developed countries in bilateral discussions, we really had the feeling that, so some of them were quite opposed to loss and damage finance. Not to name and shame, but the US were. Some other countries, like the European Union countries, when we talk to them, it appears that they were actually really willing to understand what loss and damage finance would imply, and they were listening to our proposals. And they were actually saying, yeah, but we don't know what it means. Then we said, okay, but then let's open up a space to discuss what loss and damage finance is, on top of what already exists under the XCOM and the action and support work stream. We said, let's open a space. And I think all of these discussions contributed to the opening of a dialogue to actually discuss what loss and damage finance is. And now where really it could be useful is that the research steps in and say, okay, guys, this is the research, or actually civil society organization like German Watch, saying, okay, guys, you're right, some items, part of loss and damage, are already financed, including through humanitarian action, including through adaptation, including through normal development streams. The thing is, the financing is not enough. We really know that the damages caused by climate change will be equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars. There are great studies made by Christian Aid, for example, about this, about how the points of GDP that would cost to developing countries is really above the amounts currently available for adaptation, humanitarian action, and development, but also that not only financial gaps, but also structural gaps. And this is, I think, the really role of the research to say, there are a number of things, guys, that are not funded at all. And for example, slow onset events, irreversible damage, non-economic losses of biodiversity, of culture. These things are really lacking in the current financial mechanisms. I mean, to what I understood from diverse conversations I had with the members. And I think on the road to COP27, there could be really an opportunity to contribute to the dialogue by saying, okay, guys, in terms of finance and in terms of structure, this is what is really missing. And hence maybe the need of a facility, and a lot of developing countries are pushing for it. Maybe there are other ways to increase the funding on loss and damage, which doesn't shock the positions of the developed countries. This has been to be discussed. I personally think that there is a need of additional mechanisms, but maybe this will not what would the output be of the discussion. I mean, global message is we have to increase ambition and we have to address what is missing, because there are a lot of holes. In French, we say trous dans la raquette, holes in the tennis racket. I also wanted to mention quickly, because I don't think it was mentioned yet, the huge stepping stone of philanthropies and countries already committing on loss and damage finance, on direct finance, to really finance loss, to finance addressing loss and damage on the ground. The philanthropies are a good example of this. There are 5 major philanthropies who committed $2 billion to contribute to loss and damage finance on the ground. And then there's Scotland, of course. And other countries are also were really to step in, mostly to finance the Santiago Network. And this is, again, another topic, which relates more to technical assistance. But just to have a global vision of this COP, yeah, of course, it was not enough in comparison to what is needed, what is urgent, and what is asked by developing countries. But in terms of room for loss and damage and room for different stakeholders to engage, you mentioned civil society did a great job in having a strategy focused on loss and damage. The academics, the different developing country groups, and the philanthropies. You saw that everybody was involved in the topic. So still a minus, because we have to be critical when it's come to climate action. So still a critical, still a negative mark, but a lot of positive progresses still.
Thank you for that. I don't know if my colleague Grace would like to ask the next set of questions. Grace, are you in a position to understand the network isn't as good? Are you in a position to support our speakers with the next lot of questions? Hello, Grace. Okay, Grace is having a bit of technical issues. So I'll start with you, Ivana. I don't know if you are there at COP23, but at COP23, the Fiji Clearinghouse on Risk Transfer was established to catalyze action and support Binance state actors. From, uh, let me, Binance state actors. From your knowledge, Ivana, how has been the involvement of non-state actors within basically the Fiji clearinghouse for risk transfer since COP22, basically?
If you'll allow me, I would skip this question because indeed COP23 is a little bit before I came into this field. So I'm afraid that I would not be able to speak on this question.
Okay, I don't know if Betha would like to shed some light on basically the Fiji clearing house for risk transfer, basically what it entails and what sort of engagement has been there, especially when they talk about non-state actors. Betha, I don't know if you're there. We can't hear you. We,
Sorry about that. I was saying I have a bit of connection issues, so I'm turning off my camera from time to time. I have to say from the start, I'm not an expert on this. I have a vague idea of what it is. And my understanding is that it's more of like a sharing platform, for experiences of, basically it's just a platform to get to know experiences and share them. And if anyone knows more about it and wants to correct me, they're very welcome. And in that sense, I mean, obviously sharing experiences that are like actions and ways of doing things and models to address these issues is always important. It's always important to have this exchange of what everyone else is doing to learn and to identify, case studies, etc., that it could be replicated or implemented. I would just question how that responds to the urgency of the action necessary, and from the point of view of finance, what does it do, to actually finance responses to losses and damages. But I will leave the floor there because, as I said, it's not my field of expertise. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I don't know if Pierre or Malcolm would like to shed some light. Pierre, do you know anything
Yes.
concerning? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've followed a bit. I was part of the French delegation back then, but I was following more the adaptation topics. I'm afraid I don't know enough about the Fiji clearinghouse for risk transfer, and so I'm really pleased to hand it over to Malcolm, who surely has more insight than I do. I hope so.
Yeah, well, I wish I had some notice this question. Then I could have actually asked the Secretariat for some numbers, because obviously, as the chair of the WIM, I know all about the Fiji clearinghouse, but I don't have the numbers in my head. Fiji clearinghouse is basically a web-based platform where people can ask questions about risk management. And there is a whole bunch of experts kind of like in the background who will answer those questions. And questions have been very varied. And indeed, the experts are varied, from insurance experts to others who are there to answer questions. If you search Fiji Clearinghouse, you'll find the website. You'll be able to find the queries and the kinds of things that are being answered. And it is an active website, and it's an active thing that keeps going. If you like, it's kind of like a Santiago Network, but it's kind of like in miniature, because it's web-based. So that's the kind of thing it does. And it was being set up. And a number of people have found it very useful.
Thank you, Malcolm. It feels as if loss and damage has a lot of technical work and research that needs to be done for us to understand. Sticking over to you, Malcolm, I'm glad that you're here, and we've seen all these networks and mechanisms and everything being set up. I'm glad that you're the chair of the WIM, of basically the WIM, also international mechanism. So I'll jump straight right to that question. So the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage was established to enhance action and inclusiveness of financing for loss and damage. The Santiago Network on Loss and Damage was supposed to be operationalized at COP26, I think that we've had, but it focuses on technical work, of course, not finance, which Pierre has mentioned that there are some people who are looking to support the technical work. but not actually, it isn't clear if it's going to finance basically the loss and damage. Basically, I like to like change the question a bit. What is the WIM basically for those of us who don't know, and how is it different from basically the network, and what intended to do? What was the purpose of basically forming the Warsaw International Mechanism, and how is it linked to basically the Santiago Network on loss and damage? We can't hear you.
The Warsaw International Mechanism was, and the number of the COP just has just flown out of my head. It's a constituted body under the UNFCCC. It has 20 members, 10 from Annex 1 countries, 10 from non-Annex 1 countries, and it exists to build understanding, action, and support on loss and damage. It's largely a technical body, and so therefore it has produced reports with the IOM on climate and migration. It has produced reports on slow onset events. It has produced reports on action and support and all those kinds of things. And it has an extensive website with a lot of technical work in it. And that's basically what it does. It has a work plan of technical work. And it has various expert groups that help it. So, for example, the expert group I was most recently involved in produced a special journal issue on slow onset events, and that was collating the best science available in time for that to feed into the IPCC Working Group 2 report, to make sure that that was available to that publication. So it's very much a technical body of the UNFCCC. It reports every year to the COP and gets directions from the COP and the CMA. From the CMA and because it's mentioned under the Paris Agreement. The governance of the Warsaw Mechanism remains a bit of a unsolved mystery, but that's very sort of cobwebby end of the negotiations. So I think that's what it does. In terms of its relation to the Santiago Network was established, in a way, everything to do with loss and damage under the convention is part of the Warsaw International Mechanism. But the executive committee doesn't really have any managerial responsibility for the Santiago Network. The Santiago Network will be encouraged to report to the executive committee on what it does. So the way the Santiago Network will report to the Conference of the Parties will be through the executive committee of the WIM. So that's the relationship between the Santiago Network and the WIM. And also the Santiago Network, of course, in terms of thinking about the Glasgow Dialogue, which is talking about funding arrangements for loss and damage, and the Warsaw International Mechanism has a working group on action and support for loss and damage. Of course, they will be working very closely together to decide how the Glasgow Dialogue will get going. So that's what happens. And I think that if you go and have a look at the Warsaw International Mechanism XCOM's website, you'll see all the kinds of technical work that has been produced by the executive committee over time.
Thank you. For me, it feels like when it comes to loss and damage, all we're doing is advancing technical support. In light of that, I'd go back to you, Ivana, because you've recently formed, of course, internship with the UNFCCC. Tell us more about this Santiago Network, basically on loss and damage, and basically how non-state actors basically have been able to engage. Ivana?
Thanks so much. I will speak kind of from memory. I hope that everything that I say is factually correct. Malcolm, please feel to correct me in case I say something that you don't necessarily agree with, or that might not be fully correct, as I'm speaking from memory. So in terms of just the overarching goal of the Santiago Network, it would be pretty much to connect vulnerable developing countries with providers of technical assistance, knowledge, resources, etc. Basically things that they need to address the climate risks comprehensively, and to address, obviously, the loss and damage. It was first launched in 2020, and currently it's this sort of a website or a web page of the UNFCCC website, which contains which contains basically information that was collected during a survey on the country's needs. So if you would go look at the countries, they had the opportunity to kind of list what their needs in terms of loss and damage are. So it was kind of this first bit of work that was done. Then between end of 2020 and then pre-COP 26, there were 6 informal consultations that were conducted and 1 technical meeting. And also a ministerial discussion. So there, even prior to COP26, there was quite a bit of input, quite a bit of discussions on the goal of the Santiago Network and what the countries kind of expect from it, etc. So we already kind of talked about how the negotiations went at COP and what was sort of the result. So the result, as far as I remember from the negotiations, is that the Santiago Network will be provided with funding, that the funding will come from developed countries. And as for the concrete structure and format of the Santiago Network, I think that right now party inputs are still being collected, and that there is a technical workshop planned, and then obviously it will be subject of the next SBI/Substa meeting. And so the hope kind of is, again, I hope that I'm saying things correctly, is that by the end of 2022 there would be some sort of formal adoption so that the operationalization can begin. And so the kind of good thing is, as Malcolm already announced, is that we know that the Santiago Network will have a secretariat and will have its own funding. So that means that it will be able to basically, even if it's, you kind of said just technical assistance, but the issue is that a lot of countries don't actually, and that is something that they expressed, for instance, in the submissions, is that they don't actually know what are their priorities, where do they even need technical assistance, where do they even need the funding to go, what type of projects, and how to address loss and damage. So although finance is really important, I think that there has been the need expressed from countries that, you know, in order to kind of channel the finance to the right things, there is this preliminary need of some technical assistance to prioritize on the sort of type of projects that they could have. And this is something where the Santiago Network could be indeed really helpful. Although obviously there is going to be a lot of work to be done in terms of not overlapping with other mechanisms and ensuring complementarity rather than doubling the effort. So yeah, those are my 2 cents. I hope that I was I hope that, again, I said everything correctly.
Thank you, Ivana. I like the way you've mentioned. So it's more of advancing, basically connecting countries that need the work to, of course, those who can finance, basically, or those who can advance the work on loss and damage. So I'd come over to something that Pierre said. Pierre, I think, mentioned a research by German Watch or an organization. Is that correct, Pierre? And basically, I'd like to ask you, given that most these discussions that we've had, that there's talk about setting up an actual facility, a proposal that was put up basically to set up an actual facility. But of course, there's also risk that it can just be another talk. Basically, it can be a political process. So to start with you, Pierre, then move over to Bertha. Why do you think there is risk that talk about creating a facility, which in ideally I think should be a fund, has the potential of being a political, just another political talk? Why do you think it might be hard to just set up funds specifically for loss and damage, basically? And I think as Pierre answers that, she mentioned something about basically the GCF and how she's worked with civil society. So better as Pierre concludes basically on his remarks, basically, I would ask you on the same question of financing and loss and damage. Do you think that within the GCF, for example, access modalities, that loss and damage could be factored basically to be part of the funding criteria, basically, or funding avenues for the GCF process, so that we factor in loss and damage in existing GCF proposals? So I'll jump over back quickly to you, Pierre, then back to Beta. Pierre?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, just to be sure that I understood the question. Is it fair to say that your question is, why is there a political risk that the dialogue doesn't conclude into a facility?
Yes, and to best make it even more clear, why do you think it might be it might be a challenge for basically potential donors to basically set aside money for loss and damage? Basically, why do you think setting up a facility might be a challenge?
Well, I don't think I have all the answers to this, and maybe I have some. So loss and damage is highly political since the beginning, and the issue of dual governance comes also back to how political it is. So you may know that on the paragraph 51 under the COP21 decision, you have something directly referring to the Article 8, not to be overly technical, but that says, this paragraph says that the Article 8 that recognizes the need to emphasize action on loss and damage should not be a claim for liability or compensation by developed countries of damages that due to climate change that has been caused by developed countries. So there is really an issue, a taboo around under the negotiations to not talk about liability or compensation from developed countries to developing countries for the damages caused by climate change. So I think this is why, this is one of the reasons, and all of you feel free to correct me, that loss and damage is so political. Because developed countries, I think, are worried that developing countries would start to claim financial compensations in a legal way, meaning to say, okay, you caused these damages, now you would have to pay for this, and you are directly responsible. This is what developed countries want to avoid, because it could lead to a number of claims, and we already know that loss and damages caused by climate change are sometimes difficult to grasp. It's the frontiers of the loss and damage notion are blurry. What is the frontier with adaptation? How can you attribute a specific disaster to climate change? How can you, for example, on the case of human mobility, migration is often caused by different factors, in which climate change is part, but the science of attribution doesn't allow to attribute really certain damages directly to climate change. Some yes, but some others not. So developed countries are afraid that the claim just become too high, and that they would be legally responsible for what they have done. So I think this is a reason why the facility could be blocked at some point. But I think developed countries are still reopen to discussions, and I feel it will be blocked if it's not precise enough. And this is where some would argue that it would just be another discussion, a technical discussion that would last for years. But I think that both developed countries and developing countries need to understand what exactly, and coming back to the report you mentioned, what exactly are the gaps, what are exactly the gaps, and what should be funded through which ways, along with the increase in the science, the improvement of the science of attribution. I think only in those two conditions, we could increasingly, the facility could move forward, and developed countries and developing countries could come to an agreement on what is loss and damage finance and what would need to be funded. Under the conditions now, I don't think that developed countries would agree to facility, at least not immediately. I think there needs to be some work done. I may be wrong. Maybe we don't need to have everything clear before going into the facility, and maybe loss and damage will never be clear anyway. I mean, the frontiers will never be really limpid. But I feel that some clarity is demanded before going further, and to reassure the developed countries who fear this climate litigation prospects. Hope that was clear. I'm aware that I talked about many
No,
different
it's
points in
okay.
a single point.
It's okay. It's okay. So, very interesting discussions. I'll come back with that. But for that, better, the GCF funds, of course, mitigation, adaptation, and also other four-pronged approach. Basically, do you think that loss and damage, just from my understanding, could be part and parcel of the two funding criteria? Because you have mitigation and adaptation, so that loss and damage is packaged under the financing mechanism of the GCF from your engagement. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll start by just saying that I agree with Pierre in what he said about the reason why loss and damage is such a political issue. The problem with the conditions that he lays is that with those conditions in mind, you could go on forever discussing the technical limits of loss and damage and never actually financing it. And I think, honestly, from the developing country perspective, that is the feeling that some developing countries have, is that the objective of this is just pushing the bar to, what is loss and damage? We don't know what loss and damage is forever, so that it never has to be addressed. And that's a fear, and of course, if we need to meet those conditions, the likelihood is we'll never get any loss and damage finance. It's interesting because a lot of the talks before were focusing on technical work that has already been done. And so I think it was Pierre who mentioned, like we already have adaptation finance, we already have humanitarian aid, and then there's this and this and this missing. So you see, you already have an idea of what's missing. The problem with that is that obviously that could lead very quickly to things that are hard to put a price on, like cultural, or community loss and things that are really hard to price. But also because it could lead, as he said, to potential litigation and demands for compensation. And as attribution science moves forward, that is more likely. And I'm not sure that the fear is that we don't have enough attribution and therefore the claims could be super high. Maybe the fear is that we might at some point have enough attribution science to explain this, and then the claims is still going to be high, And so it's a bit like, where do we stop with the demands for a clarity until we can actually implement finance and financing for loss and damage? It could never end. And this is why there is a fear that this dialogue could be just more talk with that end, because, where do you set the line, and who sets the line? And what specifically concerning the Green Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund already has a mandate to finance loss and damage. The problem with that is that it is unclear what it is. And I'm going to take that to a bit of the issue with this loss and damage finance discussion, which is, to make sure that it is additional to what already exists. And this is a demand of developing countries to separate very clearly what is humanitarian aid, what's adaptation finance, and loss and damage finance has to be on top of that. And so that's obviously a problem in the way it's addressed in the Green Climate Fund, because if you look at the Green Climate Fund as it is set now, it's only adaptation mitigation. So a lot of the claim to loss and damage finance is actually adaptation finance. And this is a problem for developing countries, at least, of course, because they don't want adaptation finance to be labeled as loss and damage finance. They want loss and damage finance to be additional to what was already promised. So, for example, if you think about the finance goals, currently we're talking about 100 billion, and the 100 billion is for adaptation and mitigation, and developed countries, as we know, didn't even reach that commitment. But what we don't want, or what developing countries don't want, is those 100 billion to also include loss and damage. So loss and damage should be on top of those 100 billion. And now that we're starting the discussion on the new collective quantified goal, which is going to be the goal that's going to be set for the post-2025 period, we want that conversation conversation to include adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage finance as three very distinct parts of finance in the future. And so that's where the conversation is. But as I said, I mean, technically, the Green Climate Fund already finances loss and damage, but it's just part of the same money, the same pot of money that is not even sufficient as it is, that goes into adaptation and mitigation risk. And so that's where kind of like the real critical issue is at this point with the Green Climate Fund and more in general as well.
If I may quickly
yes.
reply to Beth, I just to say that I agree with her entirely. I mean, there will never be a point where we're clear enough on loss and damage so that we can unleash finance. I was just trying to think about the reasons why it could be so complicated for developed countries to agree with developing countries now. But in the collaboration, I coordinate actually we have mostly developing countries' interests, and this is actually one of the sharp criticisms they do to loss and damage discussions and to the position expressed by developed countries. Is that we need to action now, and we will never be so clear on loss and damage that you will be fully happy with everything you ask, but we need finance now, and we need finance based on needs that are already on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you for that very wonderful discussions. I think, Malcolm, I'll come over to you and bombard you with now a more combined question, of course. What do you think the political issue or the drug might be in setting up a facility? And I know I believe you're an expert within the funding mechanism, basically. Do you think, like, for example, the GCF, of course, and also the GEF, because the GEF also funds climate change, basically, through, I think, the Special Climate Change Fund and also the trust or something. Do you think that in addition to, just like the GCF could potentially, has the mandate but has not, it could include loss and damage finance basically within their funding mechanism? That's, so of course, I'm asking you in light of also the GEF. And what do you think are the political issues that might drag a facility being set up? Malcolm?
I think that as part of the Warsaw mechanism, it's exactly the question we asked the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund came back with saying two things. The first thing they said is that loss and damage is not well defined. And therefore, if you ask us what we fund on loss and damage, we scratch our heads a little bit because it's not a precise category. But having said that, if you think about what do we fund about responding to climate impacts, here are some examples. And they're not exhaustive. And they gave a list of projects. So I think funding is already flowing that is relevant to loss and damage. And I think that what came out of COP20, last COP, is that it was agreed that actually more needs to be done. So I agree with Pierre. The issue is not so much, there needs to be a fund for loss and damage, but there needs to be additional funding. And that often comes out as additional funding for loss and damage, therefore needs to be a fund with a label loss and damage. And there you run into a political problem. Whereas I don't think you have anybody would say that actually the funding's not enough. We haven't got to 100 billion. And that, in fact, that, there definitely needs to be more than there is now. So I can see that both sides in a way is right, in that the developing countries will say, we need funding for loss and damage that's additional to what's going on already, right? And therefore we want a fund for loss and damage. And the donors saying, having a fund for loss and damage doesn't make any difference because we already fund loss and damage. But actually, the point there is the additional for rising needs. And that's the key. And so I think that there on at COP26, we got some good progress on that additional funding. Because people will say, and indeed the OECD did that report on losses and damage saying, yeah, we already fund it. And that's been the very strong view of the developed countries to say, we already fund it. So why do we fund a fund on loss and damage? But the point that the developing countries make, say, is this needs to be additional. We need more finance to deal with increasing climate impacts. And you can see the point on both sides. I think the very worst thing that could happen is they say, fine, let's have a fund for loss and damage. And immediately half of what used to be spent on adaptation suddenly just gets labeled loss and damage, or half of what was spent on humanitarian just gets labeled loss and damage, and you don't end up with any extra money. That would be a very bad outcome. So in there's some real political and practical work to do to really define what enhanced practical action actually means. And I think that is the challenge for the Glasgow Dialogue Santiago Network and what needs to happen going forward to COP27.
Thank you, Malcolm. Very interesting insight. You've talked about the worst thing that could happen is the fund, of course, that goes to adaptation being labeled fund for loss and damage. But CPI released a report, that's the climate finance flows, basically 2017-2018. And the amount of funding that is already going basically to adaptation is less than 10%, because 93% of the funding goes to mitigation and the other goes to adaptation, because I think a bit of issues might arise basically because it is less attractive to the donor or the funding agency. I have a quick question. If basically if basically what is the difference between adaptation loss and loss and damages? I think this also might be one of the key of the key questions in contempt. And if already adaptation funding for adaptation is that difficult or is less attractive, if we do set up a fund for loss and damage, do you think it will also be as difficult or as unattractive to the funding donors, the funding people funding issues of climate change? Do you think it will even be more difficult to access funding for loss and damage, even if it's there? Because a donor might not see a return on investment the way adaptation financing is already not attractive. Malcolm, over to you, and then maybe your perspective, and Pierre and Ivana.
I think on the funding for adaptation, it is too low, and there's a undertaking double adaptation finance that was done at COP. I think the issue is that a lot of adaptation finance is grant-based rather than investments and loans, which is another reason why it's lower. I think there's not much difference between loss and damage and adaptation finance. Indeed, they would overlap a very great deal, as would disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, disaster response finance. Those all tend to be grant-based. And therefore, I don't see very much difference in attractiveness between the two. If anything, I think action on loss and damage would be more attractive to donors because it is much more immediate, if you like, in responding to real human need. And I think that the real need is to join up that action so that, one, we prevent as much loss and damage as possible, because we know that we've not gone as far as we can in preventing loss and damage here, and actually set up a system that does respond at the scale required of the challenge of climate change. And we're not there yet. And I think that was clearly recognized.
Pierre, Ivana, anyone has to say? Anyone has anything to say, or better, in addition?
Maybe just to kind of agree with what you actually pointed out, which is, this, I think that when you talk about financing for adaptation or for loss and damage, that, there is a difference to be made between, as Malcolm said, grant-based financing, which obviously doesn't expect any return on the investment necessarily, and between private investment or loans, which obviously would then have reasons for which mitigation might be more attractive to investors than adaptation or loss and damage. But I do want to say that I think that this is something that many actors in the industry are aware of. And I do think that although probably again not to the same scale as there is finance flowing to mitigation, obviously not, but there are some initiatives that are being picked up, particularly in terms of disaster risk preparedness and disaster risk reduction. I know that there are some innovative insurance products on the market that are coming to the market, etc. So I think that in the future, the investments might increase, even for adaptation and for loss and damage. But this is there is a reason why the flow of finance is lower from this sort of private side or private sector, and that's simply because the return on investment is also lower.
Thank you, Vanna. Pierre, if you have anything to add.
Thanks. Not so much actually. I have no really specific reason to believe that loss and damage would be less attractive than adaptation if loss and damage is did well and if the activities are specifically defined. And I do tend to think, like Ivana, that adaptation and loss and damage together may be less attractive than mitigation because of the lack of return of investment. It's really hard. It's really easy to see how a mitigation project can bring benefits, for example, by reducing by reducing the cost of renewing all installations that work with coal, by being more enhanced on the markets as well with a system of taxes and subsidies. So mitigation projects, I think, tend to be more economically viable than adaptation loss and damage project. And this is also why you don't see, you see a lot of UN and NGO and civil society people calling private sector to step in. You see a lot of private sector people telling we are willing to step in on adaptation action. On the ground, you don't see a lot of private investment flowing into adaptation. Yeah, this would be my insight on that.
Thank you for the final and last question. I'm glad. Yes, I'm glad that the issue of private sector has stepped in. If we are to set up a facility to address issues of loss and damage, basically, how would you describe the role of the private sector in supporting, advancing, loss and damage financing projects and objectives? So how would the private sector come in? Because we know that the space is opening up basically for basically those with the money. So basically the private sector, the banks and such entities. And I'd also like to start with Beta, because I know the GCF also has a private sector facility or something like that. So how would such a facility come in when it comes to financing for loss and damage, if we were to agree and to set up the additional, financing as highlighted as highlighted basically earlier for loss and damage? So I don't know if she's here or anyone can just have a tackle at the question.
I'm here, but I think you're the only one that can see me. I got off and then I come back in and it said that now I think now it's everyone, but at the beginning it said that you're the only one that could see me. So I'm sorry, I kind of caught the last bit of the question about private sector, and I kind of wish I had heard more about it, because I kind of jumped into the next. But more to follow up on that with what you just asked, because I want to say first and foremost that it's already quite hard, and I think that's kind of the point that was being made, to engage the private sector in adaptation. It's been quite challenging. It's often the reason why, as I think Pierre was saying, which I think I caught that at the end, mitigation projects are so much easier to fund. That's partly, at least, an explanation for the imbalance that we often see between mitigation finance and adaptation finance. And to me, that is very likely to carry to loss and damage. Apart from insurance, which might be the kind of entry point for the private sector, I have a hard time thinking about any other ways in which, I mean, not that it doesn't exist, there's like new models, new strategies that have been developed for the private sector to engage in this kind of financing that is less traditional, mixing, blending finance with, private sector finance with more charitable funding, etc., to try to find different ways in which private sector can be brought into this conversation. I'm going to go more on the practical level experience at the GCF. What we have seen at the GCF from the civil society perspective is that there is a big risk, and I think it will extend to loss and damage finance, that if the goal is if you make attracting private sector a goal in itself, it can end up damaging the outcomes that you're looking for. And, I'm not trying to predict the future, but we have seen quite a few projects presented to the private sector facility of the GCF that, from the point of view of local communities and civil societies, are less than ideal and are very ripe for maladaptation. And they get pushed by because there is this focus on private sector finance and leveraging and mobilizing private finance. And then sometimes the stringency of what adaptation is and of what preventing maladaptation is and what benefits to communities are go out of the window a little bit in the interest of promoting private sector finance. And so I think it is important and we need to find ways to promote it, but I would caution, and especially moving into the conversation also of loss and damage, but it should be kept in mind that it's not, at least from the perspective of, developing countries and climate change, it should not be the ultimate objective, but it is a way of achieving the objective of adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, etc. Because sometimes I feel like that gets forgotten, and it gets forgotten because obviously, and this is my theory, the 100 billion that developed countries promise is built on a lot of private sector finance. And if you listen to the conversations in COP, the narrative was that they didn't achieve the 100 billion because public finance did its job, but the private sector didn't respond. And so they were trying to say, well, basically the problem is that we don't mobilize enough private sector finance. And the problem with that is that in order to achieve this 100 billion, we might see more private sector finance that is actually not achieving any positive impacts so it's not that it's going to happen. All I'm saying is we should be very cautious not to turn private sector into a goal in itself, and to really assign to the private sector that the things that private sector can actually take on, because a lot of these things are human rights related issues. They are public goods and services issues that are not easy to give to the private sector. And I think this is something just to keep in mind, not only in the adaptation finance conversations, but also as we move towards important issues on loss and damage, like cultural loss, etc. How do you put that private sector into cultural loss? How do you finance? It's possible. All I'm saying is it is something to be very careful about, because the private sector is important and it has to play a role, but it cannot become the ultimate goal of this. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Malcolm, if you have some insights, I'm sure you can't miss an insight on private sector involvement. Meta has highlighted it shouldn't be the main goal because we lose focus on the bigger agenda, basically. So, Malcolm, what is your take on how private sector can get involved, basically, as, of course, you make your concluding remarks on the way forward going into SB 54 on loss and damage? So, what is the engagement framework for the private sector within loss and damage finance discussions now and discussions to come in the future?
I think there's been a lot of talk about insurance and risk financing and how that can help, and whether in fact there's more that can be done with risk finance. Of course, this is then criticized because people who are poor communities or communities that face repeated shocks, insurance and risk finance is not appropriate. So that there's an issue there. But there is something about more insurance and risk finance that's important. I agree with all of what Bertha said, and I won't repeat it. I think that the only other thing to say is that I think the private sector is beginning to wake up to the fact that their businesses are threatened by climate change, and therefore they are going to have to adapt and make sure that their businesses are viable for the long term. In this, they're being pushed by their major investors, and the GFANZ thing and the stuff that came out around Glasgow talking about the sustainability of investment. So I think the incentives for the private sector to invest in adaptation are growing from purely a self-interest point of view, because otherwise their businesses will not be viable in the long term. But it's slow. And we're not there yet. So I think that is. I agree with what Bertha said. It's not an easy one.
Thank you. Ivana, as you make the concluding remarks, what is your perspective on private sector engagement, of course, within loss and damage discussions?
Thanks so much. I honestly don't really have that much to add, except I really value Bertha's insight. I think that she really hit the nail on the head with many of the issues, and as she previously, I'm not sure if it was Pierre or Bertha who previously mentioned that, many of the losses are non-economic. So, as you try to intervene also on that, the engagement or the potential engagement of the private sector is quite unclear and potentially dangerous for communities. So definitely, there is quite a bit of work also to be done there, and I don't have the answers to how exactly private sector might intervene on loss and damage in the future, but on the one hand, I think that they are definitely an important actor with a lot of power, obviously, to a lot of money to change a lot of things, but definitely should be treated with caution, and the question should not be to privatize the suffering of communities.
Thank you for that emphasis. Pierre, what is your take?
So, yeah, a lot has been said already, so I'll try not to repeat. I think I agree with most of what have been said. On what Welcome said on private companies that need to address loss and damage because it's part of their business. I think it's really true, especially for companies who have supply chains and they need to invest in those supply chains, both to adapt them. For example, I think about the big cocoa and coffee companies, or even sugar mining, also cosmetics companies that have interest in adapting and helping their farmers to adapt, the farmers within their supply chains to adapt to climate change. But then also maybe why not to recuperate from a disaster and to be more resilient, to come back into business when a disaster strikes, for example, a specific coffee producing region for a coffee company. That being said, I still see this bit limiting because often private companies, when they do development project, they don't have a community approach, and of course this investment will remain focused on the supplies and the products they have. So I still see a lot of limits, but as all of you also already mentioned, I don't think I have anything much more to say on that topic.
Thank you, Pierre. And basically, as the speakers give the final remarks, what advice would you give to young people on how they can engage the governments and entities basically working on loss and damage, civil society, to give to young people on how best they can engage these people, entities and agencies that are dealing with loss and damage at the grassroots level? How can young people support loss and damage initiatives at the grassroots level, at the community level, where all these things happen? So we can have a round of that as we conclude. Basically, I can start with Ivana.
Thanks. So I would say that my answer to that is perhaps a little obvious. I don't have any innovative insights on that, other than look for local initiatives, local NGOs, local youth groups, where if you want to take concrete actions, and then perhaps one advice that I would give, which I see oftentimes within myself and with other young people, is to on these sort of dividing issues, is to really do a lot of research and to try to understand different perspectives, and to see different facets of the problem, and to not become overly militant or overly set in one position, because although it, well, especially on kind of on the issues regarding climate change, it's quite easy, and I think that it's reductionist to the complexity of the issue. So really, I encourage anyone who might be watching to read a lot, and there is a plethora of information to look into all the different facets of these issues.
Thank you. Pierre, final remarks, then I don't see better, then we'll finish with Malcolm.
Yes, I think Betha had to leave based on what she told us in the chat of this webinar. Yeah, at the grassroots level, I'm not so sure. I mean, there are a lot of ways to engage for young people. I would advise on the field to not focus so much about loss and damage, but focus more on disasters, focus on projects or NGOs doing nature protection program or nature-based solutions in general. And you may have also local adaptation agencies. So at the grassroots level, you won't find a lot on loss and damage per se. Then at the advocacy level, there's a group, part of the larger group I'm part of. Sorry for the grammar. So it's called the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. It's a group of young people from everywhere that try to contribute to advocacy and outreach on loss and damage as well as they can, and they have their own structure, their own funding, and they are part of our larger collaboration of people involved on loss and damage. So this group of youth, young activists, are really engaged. So if members are interested, I encourage, to look it up on internet. It's called the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. And in this group they have a lot of young members involved on advocacy on loss and damage from everywhere in the world.
Thank you, Malcolm.
The first is, don't underestimate your power. I think that the voices of civil society and youth are powerful, and they need to be heard more. And I think that they are very powerful because they can tell the truth about what people are experiencing day to day. And I think there is the strongest link, and that youth advocates can link with what is happening on the ground to what is happening in the negotiations, and put the two together and show the gap between what needs to happen and some of the rhetoric in the rooms. And I think that is a very powerful way of doing it. I think if you look at the degree to which civil society and youth have grabbed the headlines around the world, saying that shows the power of that. And so I would encourage the youth to keep doing it.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, our speakers in general. Ivana, thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Malcolm. And thank you, Betha, for basically supporting these discussions today on loss and damage. Indeed, I think we have a lot basically to learn as young people and a lot to contribute. And with that, I think we can close the session. And we'd like to invite you to the other webinar series. The next session is set to basically explore how young people can engage with the Green Climate Fund, basically avenues of engagement at the international level, at the continental level, and of course at the national level. We have a team from the Green Climate Fund who are willing to support these discussions. So we ask you to tune in and basically keep watch and subscribe to basically our YouTube channel for more information. So thank you and good night. And please don't forget to submit your climate change stories to our website and our link, everyone. So bye bye, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks.